I see, so this is the heart. 4 seconds before he turns to ash, the most emotionally hollow character in Bleach finally gets it. And then he's gone. And that line has been living rent-free in people's heads for over a decade, because it's such a perfect ending and such an incomplete explanation at the same time. What is he seeing? What clicked? Why now? Why her? Why in the exact moment he's dissolving into dust with his arm outstretched toward a girl he kidnapped and terrorized? People have been arguing about that scene forever, and the two most common answers are 1, he fell in love with Orihime, and 2, he learned that emotions are real. And I don't think either of those is wrong exactly, but I think both of them are shallow, and I think they're missing what's actually happening in that scene by a mile. Ulquiorra didn't change his perspective at the end. He dropped a lie he'd been telling himself for his entire existence. His nihilism was never a philosophy, it was armor. The Espada are each built around an aspect of death. Every one of them embodies a different facet of what death is, and their whole personality and power set radiate out from that concept. Ulquiorra has the aspect of emptiness, nihilism, void. He is, by design, the personification of nothing meaning anything, and he plays that role to absolute perfection for basically his entire screen time. His whole thing is that if he cannot see it with his eyes, it does not exist. He says it constantly. He tells Orihime she has no heart. He tells Ichigo he has nothing worth fighting for. He dismisses emotion and connection as things he cannot perceive, and therefore things that are not real. He's got a cold voice, a permanently bored expression, and the deadest eyes in the entire series. He is, on the surface, the most thoroughly nihilistic character Bleach ever produced. There's a difference between a character's stated philosophy and their actual psychology, and the great writer will let those two things contradict each other on purpose, without ever pointing at it. A stated philosophy is what a character says they believe about the world. Their psychology is what's actually driving them underneath. And when those two things can't match, the philosophy is almost always doing a job for that psychology. It's not an intellectual position they arrived at through reasoning, it's a defense mechanism they built out of pain and then presented it in the language of reason so it would feel like wisdom instead of a wound. There's even a rough real-world version of this. When a person can't have something they desperately want, one very common coping response is to devalue the thing entirely, basically saying that thing isn't even real, it's meaningless, only fools care about it, which hurts a lot less. You demote the thing you're starving for into something worthless, because a world where the thing doesn't exist is more survivable than a world where it exists and is being withheld from you specifically. Kubo released a special chapter outside the main run, showing Ulquiorra before he was an Arrancar, back when he was a hollow in Hueco Mundo. He was born a Vastolorde, naturally, not through cannibalizing his way up the hollow food chain in the usual grinding, brutal way, but simply as what he was from the beginning, sitting at the top of the hollow evolutionary ladder from birth, and he looked nothing like the hollows around him. He was white in a place of darkness, alone, wandering, and the other hollows of his kind avoided him. They didn't attack him, they just kept their distance, because he was too different and too powerful and they were afraid of him. So picture this existence: immense unmatched power, complete total unbroken isolation. Nobody ever came near him, nobody ever accepted him, nobody was ever unafraid. Do you see what that does to the nihilism? Go back and listen to everything he says with that in the background. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist. You have no heart. Nothing means anything. That's not the calm conclusion of a being who examined existence and found it empty. That is the enormous wall of a creature who spent an eternity alone and needed connection to be fake. Because if connection is real, then his entire existence has been a specific and unbreakable kind of deprivation. If the heart does exist, then he is a being who has never had one held out to him. If the heart doesn't exist, then he isn't missing anything and nothing was ever taken from him. And the loneliness was just the correct way to be. That's the deal he made with himself. He traded the possibility of meaning for the absence of pain. And there's a detail in his power set that I think is the single most emotionally revealing thing about him. and it's the kind of thing you only notice on a rewatch. His final form, his segunda etapa, the second stage release nobody else in the Espada has, what he unveils against Ichigo. When Ulquiorra reaches the absolute limit of what he is, what does he become? He goes darker, he sprouts wings, he takes on a bat-like form that's a world away from the pale, isolated figure he was. His truest, deepest, most authentic form is not the emptiness he claims to represent. His deepest self reaches for a shape. There's a hunger in it. And when your ultimate expression of self is a transformation towards something, you are not a being defined by nothing. His own powers are snitching on him. His body knew what he wanted before his mouth ever admitted it. So that's the setup. And now we can actually get to the fight. Ulquiorra and Ichigo throw down, and Ulquiorra wins. And the way he wins matters. He doesn't just beat Ichigo, he obliterates him, blows a hole through his chest, and drops him. And does it while making his entire philosophical point out loud, proving to Orihime that hope is empty and her friend's resolve was nothing. And then Ichigo comes back in that horrifying hollow form and utterly destroys him, breaks him apart with a savagery that isn't heroic at all. And Ulquiorra in the aftermath actually gets his one flicker of something before the end, remarking on what Ichigo has become. But the moment is what happens next. After the fight is over, after he's lost, when he begins to disintegrate, Ulquiorra starts turning to ash. He's dying. And he looks at Orihime and he asks her, essentially, are you afraid of me? And that is the question he has been asking silently for his entire existence and never once had answered in his favor. Every hollow that ever kept its distance answered yes. Every being that ever looked at him answered yes. Fear is the only response he has ever received from another living being, and it's the reason he was alone, and the loneliness is the reason he decided the heart wasn't real. And Orihime says no, and she reaches for him. She reaches out and takes his hand as he's dissolving, and she's crying, not because she won, she's crying because he's dying. This creature who kidnapped her and killed the boy she loves in front of her. She extends compassion to him at the exact moment he is least deserving of it and least able to demand it. And that's what breaks him open. For the first time in his entire existence, someone looked at him without fear and reached out anyway. His whole nihilistic mask was built on one foundational point: that connection is impossible and therefore isn't real. And Orihime in 4 seconds disproved him with an act. She gave him the thing he'd spent an eternity insisting didn't exist. And the moment he received it, the lie collapsed. Because you cannot keep believing the heart is imaginary while it is physically reaching out for your hand. Ulquiorra's story is structurally a rehearsal for Ichigo's. Think about what Ichigo's entire journey is actually about underneath the sword and the power-ups. Ichigo spends the bulk of the series terrified of his own inner hollow, that version of himself that wants to take over and represents everything he's afraid of becoming. And later he has to reckon with the fact that the figure he trusted most inside himself, Old Man Zangetsu, is not what he appeared to be either, and is tangled up with a legacy Ichigo finds frightening. Ichigo's core problem is that he cannot accept the true nature of what's inside him because he is afraid of it. His whole climax is learning to accept those parts of himself despite the fear, to stop rejecting the thing he's scared of and integrate it instead. So you've got Ulquiorra's arc, acceptance received from the outside, running as the prelude to Ichigo's arc, acceptance given on the inside. I think this is why the Ulquiorra ending resonates so far beyond the boundaries of his own character. He's the proof of concept for the idea the whole series eventually resolves on. Fear is what isolates. Acceptance in spite of fear is what makes something whole. Ulquiorra gets 4 seconds of it. Ichigo gets to build his entire identity on it. Same lesson, 2 directions. Okay, now let me argue the other side. You already know. You could build an argument around the fact that the backstory chapter came later. It was released outside the main run. And there's a legitimate argument that reading it back into the Hueco Mundo arc is reverse engineering. That I'm taking a piece of supplementary material and using it to retroactively install psychological depth into a character who in the actual serialized story was written as a fairly straightforward cold antagonist. If the loneliness explanation isn't in the fight itself, is it really what the fight was about, or is it what fans decided it was about once they got new information years later? There's also the romance question. A lot of people read Ulquiorra as having developed a genuine infatuation with Orihime and see the ending as fundamentally a romantic beat, the cold monster undone by the girl girl. You could argue that any romantic reading whatsoever is fan projection onto a character who explicitly repeatedly rejects emotional attachment, and that his final line is a purely abstract realization with no personal component at all. You could even argue that a 4-second realization at the moment of death is not a character arc. He doesn't get to live with the new understanding, he doesn't get to be transformed by it in any way that produces consequence. He simply understands and then ceases to exist. Calling this Ulquiorra changing his perspective is generous framing for what is really a beautiful death scene with no actual arc attached. Alright, on the backstory being supplementary, I'll fully concede the timeline, but the segunda etapa is in the manga. His obsessive repeated fixation on the heart, a topic he claims is meaningless and yet cannot shut up about, is in the manga. Nobody circles a concept that relentlessly if it means nothing to them. A being who truly did not care about the heart would not bring it up in every single conversation. The main run gives you a character who protests too much, and the backstory chapter doesn't invent the loneliness. It confirms something that the text was already gesturing at. Supplementary material that explains an existing pattern is different from supplementary material that manufactures one out of nothing. On the romance question, I think both extremes are slightly off. It isn't romance in any conventional sense, but it also isn't purely abstract, and the people insisting it's just philosophy are missing something crucial, which is that it absolutely matters that it was Orihime specifically, because Orihime is the one character in the entire arc who consistently refused to be afraid of him. Everyone else in Hueco Mundo either feared him, obeyed him, or fought him. She spent that entire captivity being the one person in his vicinity who looked directly at him and neither cowered nor attacked. She was the only being in his existence conducting an ongoing experiment in not being scared of Ulquiorra. My take is that he didn't fall in love with her, but he did develop a fixation on her that basically told him she was the anomaly, the one data point that his entire worldview couldn't account for. And he kept circling her and interrogating her about the heart precisely because some part of him could not stop poking at the exception. Also, for the argument saying the 4 seconds wasn't an arc, I would say the objection assumes that change means moving from one position to a different one, but that's not the only kind of change there is. Ulquiorra didn't move from nihilism to belief, he dropped a defense he'd been holding up for an eternity, and what was underneath was always there. That's why it takes 4 seconds instead of 4 arcs. Building a defense mechanism takes a lifetime, having it disproven takes an instant, because a single sufficient counterexample destroys it immediately. He didn't need time to be convinced, he needed one hand extended without fear, and the whole thing came down at once. That's an accurate depiction of how a lie you tell yourself actually ends, which is never gradually. It's always instantly. The second reality contradicts it hard enough that you can't keep the story running. So let me know in the comments, does the ending hit harder now if you've read the backstory chapter, or did you always feel the loneliness underneath the emptiness? Thanks for watching the video. If you have any anime characters or anime topics you'd like me to analyze, drop them down in the comments below. You already know, JV out!